Well, hi, and welcome to Fighting Back, our weekly webinar helping you, the entrepreneur, fight back against the impact of the COVID-19 virus on your business. From the outside looking in, an entrepreneur can look a lot like a serious risk taker, because you have to bet everything on the dream of building a business. And yet I've never met an entrepreneur who looked at their business through the eyes of a gambler. This is because as a business owner, we are eternal optimists. So while the cards may be stacked against us, we still believe we have the power to influence the odds in our favor, and often we're right. There may be a storm on the ocean, but we still control the rudder of the ship. Case in point, one of the most remarkable things to rise out of the coronavirus has been an overflowing fountain of human ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit. I'm proud to say that not one of our clients has closed their doors during this crisis. It's not that they had an easy go of it either, although some have been luckier than others due to the industry they're in, but many have seen their core business all but disappear on them. In these cases, the shifting and adapting that has occurred has been remarkable to witness. We have a door manufacturer making face masks, a steel fabricator making temporary beds, a construction equipment dealer making portable wash stations, a furniture dealer selling hand sanitizer, and the list goes on and on. Having said this, no one starts a business with the intention to pivot completely when times get tough. So the question of risk management has begun to emerge more and more frequently. How do you bulletproof a business? Well, the COVID-19 virus is unprecedented. But even without it, history has shown that the economy sits on a pendulum, swinging from good to bad and back again as time goes on. This epidemic will come to an end, but somewhere down the line, new challenges will emerge. It's inevitable. Well, where do our clients understand that risk is reduced? By building what we call a culture of excellence. In other words, an operationally independent business with the right strategy, the right people, the right structure, the right environment, and the right balance sheet to help us better understand what the risks are coming our way and what they might look like and how to better manage those risks. Today, I'm joined by risk management expert Tom Wong. Tom is Robert Half's Client Services Director. He has over 25 years of professional experience, including directing the consulting practice Ernst & Young in Vancouver as lead partner, Global Head of Risk Management for Harry Winston Diamond Corporation, and Head of Wholesale Banking Operation Risk for HSBC. Tom provides thought leadership around IT governance and risk management. Today, he'll share practical insights gained from guiding organizations of all sizes and industries through their risk management journey. Tom, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning a little bit. Now, you know that our clients are all entrepreneurs, as you know, and they're typically owner-managed companies, but they're really broad. We have every industry you could think of. They're all around the world, and they run companies, everything from just a few million in sales to hundreds of million in annual sales. So it's a really broad audience that's listening to you. But kind of given that scope, like I say, let's start at the beginning. Really, what is risk management in that context? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the way I like to think about risk management is really a tool that enables better decision making. So it's an input to your business strategy. Think of it that way as well. When you think about expanding into new markets or investing in new capital spend, be it project or technology, or even getting into a joint venture, it's how do you make informed decisions going beyond just the ROI projections. So it's another input to that. And it's also about prioritization. As business owners, I mean, many of them are confronted with many decision points during the day or during the week. And so how do you deal with those that make the most impact to your business to either increase revenue or reduce likelihood of loss? So it's really opportunity management is the way I look at that. Secondly is it also provides governance to organizations. It's a mechanism for stakeholders to keep informed. So what should the stakeholders be aware of? And so I find organizations that try to employ risk management but don't look at it from a practical perspective tend to provide too much information. So what is the right information to allow the stakeholders to make informed guidance and direction? And thirdly, it's about risk appetite. It's about, you often hear about the notion of risk taking. So it's a balance between the risk you take versus the rewards you get out of it. So it's making sure that you place your analogy, gambling, your right bet to certain actions that will have the best likelihood of increasing your or realizing your overall business objectives, be it revenue or be it whatever mandate that you have for your organization.
Right. So everything, basically. Right. Really,
It's an
like
important.
every aspect of your business is something that's what you're talking about. Really, like there's really no stone unturned with sort of the description you're giving of what is risk management and looking at your business sort of holistically. It sounds like what you're talking about. That makes sense.
That's right. It does play an element into a lot of different components within your business, but it's really a tool to help you determine what you should focus
Yeah.
on and helping you make some of those decisions. So it's not just restricted to the finance room.
Yeah.
It actually, some of the organizations I've worked with, and in fact, sales and marketing actually deploys risk management.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting. Like when like we often at Wardell, like we often talk about wearing like different like sunglasses. I'll say, oh, let's see, if you wear blue sunglasses, the world looks blue. If you wear red sunglasses, the world looks red. Are you right or wrong? And of course, both people are right. You take your sunglasses off, and maybe you see how it all fits together. And it sounds like we talk about leadership and management and marketing and finance and operations and sales, but risk management is another pair of sunglasses. Really, that's maybe a critical, broad look at how do you understand what the challenges are, and then how to use that information to make decisions in the various key disciplines of the and departments of the company.
yeah, I would agree with that. Yes, that's a good way of describing it. And also, too, is I think risk management is being practiced by many organizations. What you really want to do, why people think about a risk management program, is how do you provide consistency of how one views risk throughout the organization.
Right.
So your most experienced managers and the owner probably has a good sense of what are the risks to avoid, what are the risks to embrace. But when you expand your organization, can you say the new team coming on board will exercise the same judgment as you would? And that's why a formalized risk management program helps ensure consistency of how you deal with issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you want to talk to us for a second, maybe about what that formal structure might look like? I mean, I have a lot more questions, but I'm just curious. So, like, how do you bring some kind of structure to this idea of risk management?
Sure. If I was to break it down into components or the tools that you deploy for risk management, generally speaking, it's four things that you're trying to do from a risk management approach. Is that you want to be able to identify um, the potential risks to an initiative to your organization, whatever it may happen to be, a new project I had mentioned, or deploying technology, or growing into a new sector. Then once you're able to identify, then let's analyze it. What impact does it have to your organization? Because you're going to be able to, when you really think about it, you can come up with a list, you know, longer than your arm, with all the risk that your organization may face. But which ones should you apply attention and resources to? And then planning and acting on mitigating that risk or transferring that risk, whatever it may be. Risk management, for it to be useful, has to be acted upon. Otherwise, it's you're
Useless.
not fully utilizing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not. It's yeah. I mean, it's you have. You need to act upon your the key risk that you identify. If you're just identifying risk and just not doing anything with it, then it's not a very useful exercise.
yeah. So you made a partially answer this question, but I just like,
Mhm.
we're sitting here because it's an interesting conversation, but also because the world has just flipped upside down in the last little while. I mean,
Yeah.
you and I have both been through a few recessions going back, and one of my first guests going back a couple month or so ago said if you've been through one recession, you've been through one recession. So, in other words, it's unprecedented. But so how do we make sense of some of this stuff? Like everything's just shifted upside down, and so from a risk management perspective, what do we do about how do we view this? How do we make sense of this?
Well, first I have to say is, wow, what we've experienced these last few months, it's really turned, I think, the risk management discipline on its ears, because this is what we typically in our industry call a black swan. It's something that you don't quite anticipate it could ever happen. So it's a little bit difficult to plan from that perspective. But having said that, I mean, the tools that you use and deploy it allows you to be proactive versus reactive. So I would probably think if you think about risk management, we usually describe it as three distinct buckets of types of risk that you want to have oversight on. One is the macroeconomic risks that are they're usually risks that are generally outside of your control, like COVID, or like you know uh, the swing of the U.S. dollar, or the threat of terrorism, things like that. So those are macroeconomic type risk. Second bucket are strategic risk, and those are risk where you may be aiming your business in the wrong or less optimal direction, whatever it may be. So how you deploy technology or don't deploy technology, or where you decide to, which markets you decide to chase. And the third one is operational risk, and that is really failure to execute, be it failure in people that you have, process, or technology. Okay, so you want to categorize these risks in those three buckets. Now, the macroeconomic risks tend to be the ones that it's harder for you to anticipate and address, but the way you structure your organization and how nimble you are to be able to embrace change is how you typically, you know, deal with macroeconomic risk.
Right.
It's the other two; those are the ones you actually have a little bit much more control over.
Right.
So think of it as macroeconomic risk; it's just done to you, versus operational risk is you do it to yourself. So how do you manage the risk around operational risk and strategic risk to best improve the outcome of your business? Is where a lot of attention on risk management is focused upon.
Right.
So your point is, can you, guesstimate the next COVID, um,
You don't have an
occurrence?
answer?
Or how about another financial crisis? These are harder things for an entrepreneur to do. You're better off focusing on strategic or operational risk. That's where you can actually make a real difference to your organization.
Yeah, that's interesting. So can you maybe give us any examples, maybe from your experience um, of some of the types of operational risks that you've come across, or strategic risks that you've come across, and kind of how you've helped people to go through some of those challenges? That'd be really interesting to hear.
Sure. Okay. So this may be an, an interesting one to talk about. Is a lot of companies that I'm working with now, they're really beginning to explore embracing e-commerce. How do we,
Right.
since we can't sell to customers on the
It's easy.
ground, yeah, so how do we sell online? Right. So the example that I've often used there is, think of yourself as you're a construction company and you ship porta potties to construction sites.
Mm.
So let's look at that particular example as a process that you have. So what can go wrong? So that's one way of looking at it. First, identify what can possibly go wrong in this e-commerce business. Well, a construction site could use what? 5 porta potties at most? What if there was a keying error and somebody added an extra zero and you shipped 50 porta potties? What's the impact of that to your business, to your business relationship? And if it is a significant impact, could we build in various controls to reduce the likelihood of that happening? And actually, you can. On most online businesses, if you don't believe that you will ever ship more than 10 porta potties to a site, you would build into the program that anything that exceeds 10, it says call customer service, whatever the case is. And that's one way of deploying, risk management.
Yeah.
Versus if it was not a big deal to ship 50 because the customer is on the hook for the 50, then maybe you won't invest time and resources to mitigating an outcome. So it's really understanding, what is important to you, to your business, both from a financial impact perspective, from a reputational perspective, from a regulatory perspective. That's one example I can think of from a risk management perspective.
That's good. 50 porta potties would be a lot of porta potties.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say so. Yes, yes.
I could take the joke going in a really bad direction, so I'm gonna carry right along. Okay. So we talked. That's an example. So we have the idea of the different types
Yes.
of risk management. So now, so a company is concerned about their future. With a lot of people are right now, they're starting to think more about what does risk management actually mean for us. Is there a way we can bulletproof ourselves for the future, and so forth. And so if they think that, the people that are going to listen to this are going to really be trying to think about practical application of what we're talking about. So you know, do we need, for example, a separate function necessary to deploy risk management? Do we need to have a separate function to deploy risk management in a company, or not? And of course, these are businesses of all various types and sizes and shapes. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. How you apply that?
It would depend on the stage of your company,
Yeah.
I would probably say. So for companies, owner-managed businesses where the entrepreneur is on the ground, rolls up his or her sleeves, the risk management usually takes place with the owner there and then. As the business grows and you start bringing upon management or partnerships or third parties, how do you then provide that governance? That's when you start seeing organizations start looking at providing some form of formalization over risk management, right? When companies grow. So
Yeah.
I would say as a minimum, what would be useful is to have a risk discussion, a cross organizational risk discussion, uh, at least on an annual basis. As part of your business planning process. Some organizations do it a little bit more frequently. It all depends on the nature of your business and the rate of change. But at a minimum, I would say have a risk management discussion. When you talk about the business plan, you talk about projections where you want to take the business in the future, then talk about what can sidetrack the business, or what are I think of risk management as really resource prioritization. So where should you allocate resources to a company to execute upon its objectives, if you can think of it that way.
Well, can you let me ask you a question also another way, just to give some examples. I find maybe like, so if we're applying risk management to, let's say, a small company or a mid-sized company, I would say most of the people listening are sort of the SME space, right? Like I say, under 100 million and owner managed kind of operations, and some with just a few million. So maybe they may have a dozen employees, and others might have 1,000 employees, and everything in between. So let's just say a smaller company first of all, and then maybe give me a perspective on maybe a bit more of a mid-sized company. So for a smaller company, how would a smaller company be able to apply this? Like, give me maybe some thoughts, just your ideas on how we might apply risk management to a smaller company. You pick an industry, doesn't matter if that's easiest. And then maybe I'd love some thoughts on maybe a slightly larger company that has more structure and how they would even more formalize it.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say for smaller company, I mean, small companies don't plan to be small forever. So
No,
it's these small companies that have goals that they're trying to achieve.
yeah,
It is worthwhile to have that discussion, or what I would say, bring in a risk specialist to facilitate that discussion amongst your senior management. Because I can think of an example of a client that I have that recently encountered a technology risk that they never thought that it would impact them. But because when you're a smaller company, you're really focusing on, gee, what do I need to do to grow my company? You're focused on your customers,
mm,
and you feel, why would people target them? So I'm talking about, for instance, cyber ransom
yeah.
is a prevalent risk that we're beginning to see smaller companies being targeted.
Right. So
And
maybe
what?
just describe that, like for people that aren't
Sure.
sure what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. What cyber ransom that we're seeing now is where you have a hacker find ways into your system. And the previous risk was they would take your information and they would monetize in one way, shape, or form. But they've actually gotten bolder with smaller companies. Is what they would do is they would encrypt your information. So then that way they lock you out from accessing your information, and they would corrupt your backup. So in other words, if you want your information back, they would ask for payment in
Yeah.
bitcoins. And so we've seen that happen to several clients as well.
Amazing.
So therefore, the question there is, when you look at your risk and you look at your risk profile, if something was to happen to your organization where you cannot access your financial information, your client data, your intellectual property, would that matter? I think that's the question. And then if you quantify it and you look at the likelihood of this occurring, then you make the decision: should you invest in uh, improving your cybersecurity?
Yeah.
So that's how it helps you make decisions, because it's expensive to invest in beefing your cybersecurity. Should you spend that money on that, or should you invest in building an e-commerce platform, or whatever the case is? These are decisions I believe small businesses need to make, because you can't do it all.
Yeah.
So what do you prioritize? And risk management is an input to that prioritization.
Yeah, well, you gave me an example offline of Zoom. Right? You
Mm-hmm.
were talking to me about Zoom and trying to make a decision. Obviously, people are so worried about Zoom, and yet it's a very useful tool. And so people are worried. Should I stop using Zoom? What about my information being, if they've got servers in China, should I be worried about that? That sort of thing. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's where I feel a formalized risk management approach does help as well,
Yeah,
because a lot of times there's a lot of information in the media that really it throws out a fact, but it's not based on what it means to your business. And so the couple of vulnerabilities that was identified in Zoom is, one is this kind of a Zoom um, photo bombing, or whatever you
yeah,
call it, where somebody intercepts a meeting that you have and puts on
that,
savory
yeah,
you know
yeah,
like you hear about that. Okay, so and then the second vulnerability that was identified as well, Zoom servers are all in China, and so there may be a risk of a foreign government being able to listen in to your Zoom meetings. So you take that fact, and if you just act upon it and say, oh well, we can't use Zoom, we got to find another tool. What people have to understand is a lot of these these video conferencing tools have similar vulnerabilities. Zoom has reached the level of saturation where hackers are focusing on it. It doesn't mean other tools don't have those issues. Some have it more than others. So therefore, if you don't use Zoom and you choose something else, it may have similar problems. Second way of that you have to look at is, so what is Zoom doing about these security vulnerabilities? And actually, when I look at it from my IT risk perspective, I think they're taking good and positive action in improving end-to-end encryption, as well as enforcing passwords. A lot of applications that are implemented on clients' systems, putting Zoom aside, many of them are set up with minimal security. So
right,
what Zoom is saying is, you've got to turn on security. You got to put your password. That'll reduce the likelihood of having your video conference intercepted. Secondly, is then you ask yourself, does it matter if my video conference is listened to by a foreign government? So those are things that you have to ask. I mean, if you're talking about intellectual property or key international business strategy, perhaps. But if you're having a conversation as a team meeting update or a information webinar, I would say that risk is minimal. So it's really assessing these types of situations in a structured frame of mind to help you drive
right,
a decision. Otherwise, you end up making knee-jerk reactions that may not be the best outcome for your business.
right. So you talk about a structured approach, which makes perfect sense to me. So given that we think businesses should take a structured approach to risk management, and given that the SME space are notoriously uh, uh, often can run on tight margins, and so finance is something that people are particularly concerned about all the time, right? Cash management is top of mind for most entrepreneurs a lot of the time. So how does one think about the risk reward, I guess, of capital allocation of funds, the reward of that from it's almost like insurance, I guess, in some ways, right? You're allocating, at least that's how I'm perceiving what you're saying. You're allocating funds and resources and thought to resolve things that haven't necessarily happened yet, but you want to circumvent them or stop them from happening in the future. So how do we think about this from a financial perspective for a company?
Well, I think the one way to start on that is really engaging the conversation dialogue with your business team, with your team on that, this business leaders, because the way I usually start these conversations is talking to them about resource allocation. When you look at a department, be it accounting or sales or whatever the case is,
Mm,
why do they have the headcount that they have? So one of the organizations I worked with, I had this conversation with the head of marketing, and so we started, and she said, "Risk management, that's not me. I don't need to worry about that. I'm in marketing. What does it matter?"
Yes.
And so then we had a close conversation to understand what she and her team does. And I said, "Well, you actually have a team of 8 people. What do they do? And what their team and why do you need them?" And she says, "Well, the purpose there is they're actually monitoring price fluctuations of the competitors in terms of engagement ranks. And so I don't want to be undercut by Tiffany if they drop by 5%, we can't have our product lose market share." I said, "Well, there you go. Isn't that a form of risk management? You're trying to protect your market share." So I think that's what you need to do is you need to have conversations to engage the business team to understand that risk management isn't just a theoretical exercise, but it's really need to deploy resources. Because if price fluctuation is not important, you don't need 8 people. Maybe those five of the 8 headcount can be transferred to another division where there are bigger risk or opportunities to deploy it. And if you look at it from that angle, that's how you get the interest of the different business areas.
Right. Right. So just kind of maybe following on from that question then. So, because we read a lot about appropriate risk taking, and maybe you could elaborate on what that means and how that ties into sort of what you're talking about here.
Yeah. So it's really it's risk versus rewards.
Right.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Right. If you don't take risk in your business, your rate of return would probably be a minimal rate of return. So that's why organizations that want to grow, look for new opportunities or new market, all of that, which is great. But oftentimes you see these proposals with rate of returns that are attractive, but sometimes they don't talk about the risk of doing business in, for instance, a certain part of the world or a certain industry. And so having that flip side of, okay, so we can achieve these returns, but is there a likelihood of loss or a damaged reputation if we enter into
Yeah.
this line of business? It's having those conversations and having that out and open. That's when senior management and the owners can come to an informed decision of what to invest and proceed on. I think
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to. It's additional information to help make a better business decision.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, your example, it's kind of like a risk lens is really what you're looking at.
Yeah. So maybe can you maybe help with some examples? Like I'm thinking if you're doing business in another country and there's risk with the laws there, or just maybe give me some examples, or it would be really really terrific of what you're talking about. So,
Sure, absolutely. One example is I'm thinking, like, let's say you have an expansion. You're planning to expand into let's say China, for instance. You're
yeah,
building out retail locations in China,
yeah,
and so you
that's a perfect example because we've got lots of clients right now that have been buying a lot of product from China or looking to expand or to develop relationships with Chinese factories, even investing. Like there's been a lot of that stuff that's happened, and now all of a sudden, I'm getting a tremendous amount of concern from our clients about you know for example, the Canadian government that had this big story about the planes flying back that came back from China that were empty. That this kind of stuff is very concerning
uh,
to a lot of our clients. So I didn't cut you off, but just kind of it's quite. This is happening right
mhm. It's because there's
now.
a
Yeah,
lot of business being done in China, and
absolutely.
so that's why it's very visible. So I mean, it doesn't have to be China; it could be any country.
Yeah,
But in the example that I'm using is, let's say you plan to expand your retail presence in China, and you have a timeline and target of when you're going to establish that new retail location. And so as part of your decision making processes, you establish the timeline and you built it very tight because you want to make sure you don't miss out on market share.
yeah.
But what happens when the project is delayed because you did not build sufficient buffers? Because hey, I don't know if you ever had any renovations done, but it never seemed to go on time, does it?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the question there is, what can
Mine
you
were
do
all
about
perfect, but everybody, I've heard other people have had trouble.
it? And so if you tie various management's salaries, bonuses to the on-time delivery of that construction project, what are some of the risks that you may encounter? And it's being able to identify these things. If you're late for the opening, what does that mean? And so one unanticipated risk that we talked about quite a bit when I was involved with retail operations is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So you may feel Canadians aren't affected, but if you bribe an official to grease the wheels to move a project forward, that's a criminal offense, and a company can be fined, as well as executives could be jailed.
Yeah.
So it's happened to other publicly listed companies, which I will not name here. You can easily look that up, but that's one example.
Yeah.
Another example, if you look on the flip side from a manufacturing perspective, is that when you look at risk versus rewards and efficiency, if you build all your operations and manufacturing in one location, like for instance in China, like many of our clients have, what happens when that supply chain gets disrupted? And that's what actually happened with COVID initially. Is during the Chinese New Year, the workers couldn't get back to their work site, and so the manufacturing was disrupted. And so now we're seeing organizations now have conversations about, should we diversify our supply chain? Should we have two factories? Maybe less efficient in terms of from a cost perspective, but it provides improved business continuity. So these are risk and balance and decisions that you need to make. And by deploying a disciplined, formalized risk management approach, you tend to make a better, more informed decision.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Um, Earlier, when you were talking, you just sort of briefly mentioned something about the black swan of risk management, and so I thought, would you mind elaborating on that? Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by a black swan. I just made a note, but a little more what you mean by that, and help us understand.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and so how we had mentioned before about risk management, about things that you can actually influence and affect. What a black swan tends to be is, excuse me, they tend to be events that you cannot perceive because it's never happened before.
Right.
So this goes back. The analogy was created why it was called a black swan was in Europe. Black swans don't exist in Europe, and so but it doesn't mean black swans don't exist in the world, and they come from South America. So therefore, that's why they kind of coined this black swans. Just because you never encountered it doesn't mean it will never happen.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think COVID is an example. I mean, we've had global epidemics before, but never to this scale in recent memory. So the way we look at this from a risk management perspective is these are kind of what we call generational, I guess, high watermarks, if you can think of it this way. And so when I did some work for an organization that was looking to build a transportation supply location as to which port they should move their products out of, one of the things they looked at is well, let's look at the generational watermark. What in 25 years, what is the highest flooding? And therefore, do we build to that, or do we build to 100 years? And so that's how you can, I guess, address certain black swan events. Because when a black swan event happens, it's usually fairly devastating.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge with black swans is it's kind of like the holy grail of risk management. It's what people would love risk management to be able to predict and avoid.
Yeah.
But it's not always practical or feasible to be able to do such. And so larger organizations are often chasing the ability to predict these black swans. I think of a company, a client that we have where, retail business, restaurant, and they were expanding because they were doing very well. Who could have expected COVID to shut the entire business down?
Yeah.
So that's why black swans are difficult to predict, but they are devastating. So, what more advanced risk management techniques would be to approach this? And usually, these are driven by very large global organization. Is through what they call scenario analysis. Is how do you build scenarios for these showstoppers in
Yeah.
your business? And that's one way of approaching it. And I would say that when you're ready to look at it from that angle, um, make sure that it's a very difficult exercise to do,
Yeah.
but when done well, you can actually unearth some very key information that actually leads you down the right direction.
What about, maybe you can speak to diversity a little bit as well? Like, I'm thinking of, when you mentioned the restaurant example, I thought of one of our clients. It's a small business. They're a bakery. They provide uh, bread to many of the high-end restaurants and the finest hotels in the city here. And you know, we thought, I'll be honest, we thought they were relatively diverse, that they, that the kind of impact that might hit them, because they were in a variety of restaurants, different types of restaurants, broad cross section of hotels, that felt fairly safe. I'm always worried about clients that have high concentration of their business with any particular client, but this felt relatively safe. Who would have predicted that basically the entire hospitality industry, restaurants, everything would just kind of stop one day? So, so it maybe broadens the definition of trying to have a diverse target market, so that you have a place to go to. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's something I've been thinking about and noticing with a number of our clients, that they seem to be quite broad in terms of the diverse nature of their client base. But when you really thought about it, perhaps from an industry perspective, they were less diverse than we thought. And for a small
Yeah,
company, that's huge.
it's interesting, and I mean, that's really a balance of specialization versus diversifying
Yeah,
your portfolio, and so that's a hard one. I
it's
think
hard.
that is a really hard
It's
one.
hard because from a marketing perspective, we want to target, right? We want
Yes,
targeting is often a way to really, really grow. And yet, if that industry gets shut down, you're hit over the head with a two by four, so to speak.
yes.
You
True,
know,
it's true, and so I think there is value in pursuing a broader diversification strategy. I don't know if there was any strategy that would actually overcome what we've experienced in COVID. I mean, this is truly an unusual, a very unusual event that we have. But it doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to think of diversifying both
sure.
your client portfolio, but more so on the other end, which from a risk management perspective, we talk about vendor risk management,
Yeah.
is how dependent are you on a particular supplier or a vendor to provide you critical services? And that's something that you actually can have some control over in making sure that you do have a backup or that you have multiple supply chain. So there's
Yeah.
some things you can do uh, with the use of risk management, and sometimes when you apply risk management techniques, it may say, well, you know what, this is a risk that you just might have to accept as part of doing business. It's knowing the difference between the two that is really where value of a good risk manager can provide to your organization.
Um, let's switch gears just for a second and go back to another topic that you're a particular expert in, which is technology. So we've spoken already a little bit about some interesting examples of technology and risk and so forth. But we know that technology, and we've been talking to our clients for quite some time now about aggressively pursuing and learning and figuring out how they can apply technology to the various industries that we deal with. Whether it's artificial intelligence, or whether it's robotics, or whether it's just Internet of Things, like all these different sort of technologies. Learn about them and figure out ways to play, because that's the future, and we know it. And the
Mhm.
interesting thing about COVID is it's brought that, even we knew it before COVID, and now it's brought it even more. If we didn't know it, if we didn't know it then, boy, we sure know it now. And yet, as you brought up with a couple of examples earlier, cybersecurity, and yeah, ransom. What do you call that?
Yeah, cyber ransom.
Cyber
Yeah.
ransom, yeah, and so forth, and Zoom, and these other things. There's risks inherent with chasing a technology strategy. So, you know, maybe share some of your thoughts about this and this, let's call it the darker side or whatever of technology.
Yeah, I mean, technology is a great enabler and does, like you said, open up new marketplace for you, or you gain efficiency from it. But you've got to be aware of the risks that sometimes technology brings with it, and therefore you want to make sure you build that into your plan as you deploy that technology, or the timing of when you deploy that technology.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we talked a little bit about IT security, right? And we've also talked about, resilience. How organizations are using technology to improve their business resilience by embracing video conferencing,
Right.
or they've automated their workflow in such a way. I can think of. I have several clients where very similar size. Some made an investment in technology over the last several years,
Mm.
automating their workflow and their systems, operating off the cloud, their accounting and finance systems off the cloud, and others didn't. And come COVID, we have clients that have to have their staff in the office because they could not produce a check run or process payroll unless they were physically there. Whereas other clients, it's all done remotely.
Yeah.
So that's where technology does pay off. So from a risk perspective, I think the other thing, from a more tactical perspective, that you have to look at is, while you're looking at these technology capital spend, you also want to make sure that what you're being provided and presented covers off, doesn't open you to new vulnerabilities, because sometimes technology vendors are quick to make the sale, and they sell
Yes.
the implementation to operate quickly and easily. But what
And they
sometimes gets, well, even if it does, and I've
Yeah.
seen some, for instance, automating of payables.
Yeah.
There are many systems out there that are allowing people to automate payables, which is great, and they do it based on a per transaction basis. But what sometimes we've seen is they implement this absent of controls.
Yeah.
All the payroll, payable AP controls that you've built into place there, it's not part of the contract that you sign. So that's why when you make these decisions about technology enablers, do look at it from a risk point of view: is what are we missing? What do we need to make sure? So then that way, when you actually get the business case on this new system will save X number of dollars, it's actually a true number. You're actually looking at the total cost of ownership, not just through a rosy, pair of lens. But
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can think of numerous examples of clients we have that have invested heavily, hundreds of thousands, into ERP systems or sophisticated CRM systems, only to find that they weren't really getting value from them, and had to invest many more hundreds of thousands before they were able to get to a point where they were, in fact, starting to get some of that value out of the system that they hoped to get in the first place. And it's because, I think, exactly as you say, they didn't fully understand the ramifications, the risks associated. There's a whole broad spectrum of things that they just didn't understand when they went down that path. And the sales team that sold them the tools didn't probably communicate fully what the reality was going to be. Not that they were lying; they were telling the truth. It's just there's perfect, and then there's reality.
yes,
Often,
I mean, as Canadians, we like to trust people. But
yeah,
what I think it's very important is you need to trust based on evidence
yeah,
and fact. And it's pretty hard for an entrepreneur who doesn't focus on technology or on, let's say, finance systems or ERP, to be able to properly assess
yeah,
what you need, what is available versus what you need to thoroughly customize. And so that's where we've been able to help clients, do that understanding of articulating what is it that's out there, what do you actually need to deploy, and then you can then go to the vendor with the appropriate information to say, hey, this is exactly what I'm requiring. Here's a short list of the systems. Quote. If you leave it as a blank slate, it's going to be pretty hard for any IT vendor to be able to build exactly what you need. It's like a kitchen reno. Do you just leave it to the contractor to come in and say, well, you know what, I'll put down 50,000, and trust me, it's going to turn out the way you want. And this contractor loves sinks, okay? And he's got like 4 sinks throughout the entire kitchen. And you may not want 4 sinks, right? So that's where you do need to be pretty articulate with what you need. And if that's not an area that you've done a lot in, that's where you may want to deploy a specialist in that area. And then
yeah,
once you've picked the system and you're implementing, the other thing that I also recommend my clients to manage that risk is, who's project managing that implementation. If you leave the implementation to the person who's implementing the implementation, you're not really getting an objective project manager. Either you manage it in-house with your own team, or you bring in a separate objective project manager, and make sure that the contract that you sign incorporates this, so that you're not paying for the project manager twice.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. So we're running sort of tight on time, I guess. So I think we have maybe time for just a couple of questions. We'll cap it there for now, but we'll bring a couple of questions up on the screen that have been sent in, and then we'll you've got something, a couple of gifts that you have for people as well that I'll let you talk about for just a second as well, which we really appreciate. So here's the first question, Tom. So how do I make sure that we don't miss opportunities by avoiding risk? How do I make sure I don't miss opportunities by avoiding risk?
Yeah, I think that I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. We use that Zoom as an example where we don't fully understand what the risk is that is being introduced. We just hear, oh, it's risky, without understanding, well, maybe that risk has nothing to do with your business or industry. For instance, I use that example of, well, it's the processing is done in China, the servers are in China. So is it, the risk of a foreign government listening into your web conversations doesn't matter to your business. So I think it's important to assess these risks in a formal, systematized approach. Is where I think it helps you not make a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's very easy to get tied up and concerned about risks that may not be that important. Worried about your intellectual property. Well, really ask yourself the honest question. If somebody else gets a hold of some of this intellectual property, is that genuinely damaging to my company? Or on the other hand, if it gets out there, does that actually act as a marketing? Does that support the growth of our business? And there's often two sides to the way you look at these things, I think, right? So,
Yes.
So tunnel vision is easy to happen when you've got a problem. This is what I know from experience that entrepreneurs, and that's all we deal with. Entrepreneurs, hundreds, thousands of entrepreneurs every day. So, and entrepreneurs, maybe like all of us, get fixated on a problem. And when you get fixated on a problem, man, you can't see anything else but that problem. That problem is just right in front. And I don't care what else is going on. That's the blocker. And until we solve that problem, I can't hear anything else that anybody else is saying. And so really trying to encourage people, and maybe you'd agree to, of course, focus on the problem, but also lift your eyes up and look around and see what else is around that might be surrounding that situation. And maybe it's actually not as bad as you thought, and in fact, it may even be a positive. So, yeah.
Or there may be other opportunities or problems that you really should be turning your attention to. That may be
more important. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, one more question, real quick. Some businesses will not experience a worthwhile recovery. Which industries or business models do you predict will be able to rebound quickly and experience worthwhile recovery in the long term, and why? So maybe not 100% a risk management question, maybe more a business question, but your thoughts anyway would be great. It's just even if they're anecdotal.
Yeah, you're right. This goes beyond my risk management expertise. But from what we're seeing with our clients in Vancouver in particular, what we're finding is certain industries seem to be much more resilient to COVID, or at least at this point of time. Food-based manufacturing seems to be doing quite well, but I think that's fairly obvious. But what is not as obvious is actually construction. Construction-based businesses have been, many have not been impacted at this moment. Though we do anticipate that, based on the conversation we had, that fourth quarter, it may be a little bit different because construction businesses tend to work on an existing book or contract, and these contracts are of much longer term. So, we have to stay tuned to see how it's going to impact the larger construction, both residential and commercial, in that space. Besides that, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Mark. What do you see beyond those industries?
It's difficult to predict what kind of recovery we're going to have here, how rapid the recovery is going to be, and as it does happen, what influence that's going to have on the way business is conducted, which is, I think, important to understand based on, to answer this question. I'm pretty sure that we're going to see a slightly different world, at least, maybe forever, but certainly for a long period of time, than the one that we entered with, in terms of people keeping distance from each other, or being more concerned about the way they interact with each other. And so if you sort of think about it from that perspective, and you think about your particular business, imagine a world where it doesn't quite go back to the way it was. If you're in the hospitality industry, for example, if you're in event planning, if you're in some of these industries, like event planning was a huge industry, especially in this part of the world, the lights turned off, right? And so if you think about, I don't have an answer exactly, but I think if you think about the fact that it's going to have to be done differently to attract people back into that industry to be part of that, that's imagine that world, and then if you're a business that can supply that world, or you can adjust your business to supply that world in a slightly different way. Like maybe we're seeing people advertise, clear plastic barriers between where people sit beside each other, or things like that. So think about that. Think about this world that we're heading into. Read everything you can in the news. Read industry rags and industry that's old term, old school. Read industry magazines. Read online. And understand as much as you can about what's going on in the psychology of the customers that you currently deal with, and then that will help you, I think, to at least position yourself more successfully going forward. So, some thoughts anyway. So listen, we're winding up. Before we wind up, we just maybe the last 2 minutes. Is there anything? And if there's nothing, it's fine. But Tom, is there anything that we've missed that you want to make sure you said before we sort of roll out, and you can talk for a second about some of the tools you have to offer? But anything that we might have missed that you wanted to say?
I was thinking that perhaps what I did go into detail about is when we talk about a risk management program, what that would look like, right?
Sure.
So I would say that as the kind of like the risk management 101, the starting point would probably be doing what we would call a risk assessment, or understanding what your organizational top risk are. And that is actually quite important, because what I find with some organizations, everything's important. So if you've got like 20,000 things on the list, well, I shouldn't say 20,000. I actually had this one organization that had over 10,000 critical risks. Where do you start? And if everything is important, does this mean nothing's important?
Yeah.
So I think what's important is being able to boil it down to what are really the key risks. If you had to choose, which ones to put effort into, top 5, top 10. I think that's very important. So the risk assessment piece is important, and you have to look at risks based on a time frame as well too. So within the next 1 to 3 years, what are your showstoppers? Then building a register, what they call a risk register, to prioritize and start tracking and taking some action to it. And then lastly is, well, things do happen. I mean, sometimes things do hit the fan, and so how do you deal with incident? And making sure that incident management is transparent, and having a level playing field around that, where oftentimes I've seen some organizations, they've identified issues, but then they rationalize themselves out of ever it being an issue, and therefore executive management and stakeholders never ever see the problem, because hey, look, we've dealt with it. But having said that, it hides the underlying systemic problems that the organization may have. So therefore, establishing clear approach on how you approach each of those things is very important. So then you end up getting valuable, objective, and actionable risk management actions.
It's good. Structure, planning, process. These are things that are music to my ears, as everyone knows that's watching. So appreciate it. So as we're wrapping up, I want to say I really do appreciate you taking the time to come, Tom. I know you're a busy guy, and even in the midst of all of this, maybe even busier with all the pressures that are going on and the concerns that your clients have. So I do appreciate you taking the time. As we wrap up, I appreciate you said you had a couple of things here. One, I think, is an infographic. Another is some sort of is a white paper. Do you want to just give us a quick 2-second overview of maybe what these things are, and we'll be sending them out to everybody that signed up for the webinar as a free giveaway from you, which we really appreciate.
Yeah, oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, we have a lot of thought leadership pieces that is put out by Robert Half and our sister company, Productivity. A wholly owned subsidiary of Robert Half. And so what I shared was basically a top 10 organizational risk based on a international survey that we provide every year of our clients, and it's done by the University of North Carolina. It's quite interesting, but of course that is a snapshot in time. That's what risk
Yeah,
management is. It's
yeah,
a snapshot in time. I think next year's survey will look a little bit different
yes,
post COVID, but it does give you some ideas of how other organizations are looking at approaching at risk.
good,
And so that you may want to, if you want more information on that, let me know, because there's actually quite a lot of detailed industry focused information that was gathered through that survey. And
perfect,
then the second one are just the periodic white papers that is put on. This one actually talks about COVID and what the board, should really be focusing upon. So we release these on a periodic basis, and I'd be happy to share it with you and your clients if they want to see this information. So yeah, hope you enjoy it.
fantastic. Okay, well, thanks again, Tom, and thanks everybody for watching. And we will see you all next week. Take care. Bye bye.